Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And while we are privileged to learn on these lands, we remain uninvited guests. So today's event is organized by UBC Centre for Migration Studies, and you can follow UBC Migration on Twitter. The Twitter handle is on the PowerPoint slide and is at UBC Migration. Today, Dr. Barber is going to give a presentation for about 40 minutes. The talk will be recorded, but not the Q&A. You can feel free to post your questions in the chat during the talk. And after the presentation, you will be able to ask more questions, either using the chat or raising your hand. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Barber today, whose work has been very inspiring for me, and I'm very honored to work and learn from her as she's one of my thesis committee members. And Dr. Barber is a senior lecturer in sociology at Oxford's Brookes University in the UK, and her research interests are in race, ethnicity, youth, and migration, with a focus on exclusion, inclusion, belonging, and identity formation among the Vietnamese and other East and Southeast Asian groups in Britain. A more recent project focuses on new forms of migration from Vietnam to the UK, and especially the link between Vietnamese migration to the UK and the urbanization process in Vietnam. So thank you very much, Dr. Barber, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Anne, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So yes, today I would like to talk to you about modern slavery and the construction of undocumented Vietnamese migration to the UK, which is a slightly newer area of research for me. And I would like to acknowledge my other research team members who have been involved in this project with me. So Dr. Phuc Nguyen from Trung Vuong University in Vietnam, and also Dr. Hai Nguyen from King's College, London, UK. And today's presentation is going to be based on three projects that we have been working on together over the years. So the first project was a consultancy project that Hai and I ran on the topic of becoming adult, relating to unaccompanied minors who came to the UK seeking asylum. And the research that we did was looking at young Vietnamese migrants' experiences of that process through expression on social media and through cultural media. Then we engaged in a project with Phuc in Vietnam, where we conducted a range of workshops and informal interviews with experts in Vietnam and in the UK. And we're currently working on a collaborative project, which is looking, as Anne said, at the link between urbanization in Vietnam and new forms of migration to the UK, which is ongoing. And we are conducting a range of interviews and focus groups in 3 research sites in Vietnam, in key sending areas in North and North Central Vietnam, and also in the UK. Okay, so in today's presentation, this is the broad structure I want to follow. I want to give firstly an overview of modern slavery debates and undocumented Vietnamese migrants in the UK, before moving on to look at some of the conceptualisations and debates around migrant vulnerability and precarity and agency. And then I'm going to explore with you some of the experiences from the Vietnamese participants in our projects around structural vulnerabilities and also their agency. And then we're going to reflect on the various critiques of the impact of modern slavery, anti-trafficking policy as protection policies, which the data is going to show we can be quite critical of, and also looking at the role of the UK immigration system as really sort of contributing to their forms of precarity and vulnerability. Before I want to move on, though, I just want to give a very brief overview of the situation, the context of the Vietnamese in the UK, for those of you who are less familiar with it. So the concept that I'm just moving this camera blog around so I can see my PowerPoint. Excuse me if I look like I'm fiddling. So looking at in the UK, the the cohort was quite different to that in North America, Canada and the United States. And we saw the majority of the wave of refugees coming in 1979, actually. And these were majoritarily a refugee population from northern Vietnam, who were largely ethnic Chinese and have established families and second and third generation now. And at the last British census, there were around 60,000 Vietnamese in the British population, which is around less than 1% of the overall British population, which is a very small community. Then since the early 2000s up to the present, we've seen new waves of migration, majorly international students from Vietnam, but also undocumented migrants. And we saw a real increase in international students over recent years, but also especially undocumented migrants who numbers have risen, or estimated numbers have risen from around 20,000 up to a few 100,000 in the present time. So alongside this, we also saw a boom in nail salons in the UK, which the business model imported from the American Vietnamese diaspora, and a rise in the cannabis industry in the UK, which some sources of evidence say emerged from communities which gathered expertise in Canada initially, and then when the Canadian policies changed and the liberalisation of the UK employment regulations, also decriminalisation of cannabis in the UK from Class B to Class C between 2004 and 2009, provided a perfect sort of climate for that sort of industry. But alongside this, we've seen an increasingly restrictive immigration system in the UK, illustrated through the points-based system, which made it increasingly difficult for low-skilled and unskilled migrants, especially from outside of the EU, to come to the UK, and a proclaimed hostile environment for illegal migrants that our then Home Office, leader of the Home Office, Theresa May, specified in policy in 2014. So Vietnamese migrants and nail salons have become almost synonymous with modern slavery in the UK in recent years, and Vietnamese migrants have been positioned by the British media and also in policy discussions in very polarised ways. So either as vulnerable, passive victims of traffickers in need of rescue, or as criminals breaching UK immigration and employment law. The modern slavery agenda aligns very much in recent years with tendencies of the UK's restrictive approach to immigration under the hostile environment, as I just stated. And concurrently, Vietnamese migrants have been represented as an ideal target of popular sympathy, vulnerability and suspicion, which can be understood through distinctive forms of racialisation that have existed in the UK and other Western countries around East and Southeast Asians, and also the unique migration legacy of the Vietnamese to the UK. So the debates and policy around modern slavery in the hostile environment often skew our understanding of the recent low skill and undocumented migrants, which I want to dispel in my talk today. And the danger of this is that they divert attention away from what I believe is some of the key drivers of some of this exploitation, which is the neo-liberalisation of the UK labour market. So these controlling immigration and concerns around the security of national borders, especially in the era of the migration crisis, the Syrian crisis in 2015, and of course now the Afghan situation, has become really heightened in the UK. And this has become particularly fraught in light of human trafficking. So within this broader context, the fight against modern slavery, an agenda underpinned by the Modern Slavery Act 2015 in the UK, has formed a really topical focus in public debates around immigration, particularly unscrupulous labour practices and labour exploitation. So the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act 2015 aimed to eradicate modern slavery. So modern slavery in the UK we've borrowed the definition taken from the UN's Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery, which understand modern slavery as the practices encompassed by the term contemporary forms of slavery, and cover traditional slavery, the institutions and practices similar to slavery, such as debt bondage, serfdom, forced marriage, and forced labour. So the UK approach to all of this has been very much through what is called the 4 Ps. So pursue, prevent, protect and prepare. However, it's been very much criticised as being very strongly prosecution heavy and very light on protection, which I think my data will go on to illustrate. So this focus on modern slavery emerged with the intention to consolidate and improve existing legislation on human trafficking and to make up for the deemed failure of the Palermo Protocol on trafficking in the year 2000. So the Modern Slavery Act has very close links with the trafficking agenda in relation to detecting and prosecuting criminals, traffickers and smugglers. So Vietnamese migrants in the UK have been a particularly iconic group, featuring in these oftenly emotively charged public debates. So we've seen a range, and just giving a small sample here, a range of frequent news coverage of the harsh conditions forced on Vietnamese adults and children working, say, in cannabis farms and nail bars that have very much generated public concern. So newspaper titles such as "Is your manicurist a slave?" or "Trafficked, Enslaved, the teenagers tending UK cannabis farms" have documented the experiences of long hours, low pay and exposure to noxious chemicals, highlighting the vulnerability of this group in the UK labour market. And the Vietnamese have been in the top 10 and more recently consistently in the top 3 of nationalities referred to the National Referral Mechanism, which is the arm of the National Crime Agency, which detects victims of exploitation, slavery and trafficking. But the articles exemplify a real tenor of this debate, which positions migrants as passive victims of evil trafficking gangs. And the shift in policy from a focus on trafficking to that of modern slavery has further entrenched narratives around criminality alongside those of vulnerability. So we've seen these increasing polarisation of portrayals of vulnerable passive victims versus unscrupulous gang members who operate under criminal networks and so forth. And such portrayals have been very endemic to the modern slavery approach more generally. And the modern slavery approach has been criticised, well-documented criticisms of the modern slavery approach in relation to how it makes sense of and understands migration in a number of different ways. And I'm just going to actually list these. We can explore these in more detail in the discussion if need be. But it's been in challenge for oversimplifying the realities of the realities experienced by migrants, by O'Connell Davidson. The conflation and often misunderstanding of the issues of human trafficking, smuggling and slavery, and the ways in which groups and individuals might shift between these different categories. And also it's been criticised for falling prey to moral crusading, imperialism and moral panic. So in the UK, it's probably worth pointing out that the Vietnamese have been particularly featured in a landmark legal case that put into law for the first time the existence of modern slavery. And then after that Crown prosecution case, we saw, a panorama documentary illustrating called "How I Became a Victim of Modern Slavery Gang," and it was very emblematic of basically misunderstandings of international migration and the range of different processes that are involved in the process by which migrants become exploited, and also overlooking issues of global inequity. So these attempts paid very little attention to seek understandings from the perspectives of migrants themselves, nor did they seek to locate these migrants within the broader workings of the global economy. Notably the economic demand for low-skilled labour and undocumented labour migration. And many of you will be aware of the tragic event that occurred in October 24th, 2019, where we saw the death of 39 Vietnamese migrants found in the back of a lorry in Essex, England. And these reignited public debates around human trafficking, labour exploitation and illegal migration. But what was interesting in the newspaper coverage around these deaths, was that it focused mainly, really exclusively, on the traffickers and the criminal networks, and completely overlooked the role of global supply chains and discrepancies between the neoliberal driven labour market demands and the very, very restrictive legal entry routes into the UK through the immigration system for low-skilled non-EU migrants. And these feed into very much more longer standing debates about the role of global economy, international migration and precarity. They raise important questions about how and why such situations come to rise, and how useful and effective policies like modern slavery are in addressing these issues, and how should we conceive of illegal exploited Vietnamese migrants. And so in this paper, I'm going to argue that it's a real combination of all of these factors that we need to understand in order to think about the role of modern slavery in terms of immigration, the economy, supply chains, migrant agency, and also exploitation. Okay, so I'm now going to move, oh, no, I'm not. I'm going to move on now to look around some recent academic debates around migrant agency and precarity in order to challenge some key principles that have emerged out of the modern slavery bill around consent and agency. So I just want to sort of flag up here a few sections taken from the Modern Slavery Act. 2015, which relate to these three different policy areas. So section 1, slavery, servitude and forced or compulsory labour, human trafficking, and then below the presumption about age. Now, what's interesting in all of these is the way in which this act views consent. So I'll just quickly read a couple of sections. So under slavery and exploitation, in determining, so this is guidelines on the policy, in determining whether a person is to be is being held in slavery or servitude, or required to perform forced or compulsory labour, the consent of a person does not preclude a determination that the person is being held in slavery or servitude. So the issue of consent there is irrelevant in determining who is a modern slave or not. And a similar thing goes for human trafficking. So it stipulates it's irrelevant whether V, the victim, consents to travel, and whether V, the victim, is an adult or a child. In relation to age, and again, this is around, this is important in terms of agency. The authority is if the authority is not certain of a person's age, but has reasonable grounds to believe that the person may be under 18, that presumption is in the hands of the authority who is determining that particular case. So what we see here is a very strong stance on consent, and that consent is sort of irrelevant. However, Julia O'Connell-Davison, who's written extensively about this, has argued that the issue of consent in the Modern Slavery Act very much is emblematic in overlooking the reality that pure choice is always a fallacy when it comes to migration, and that in fact that anyone who's studying migration or is a migrant themselves understands that choice and constraints is always a fluid, ongoing negotiation. There's never any black or white absolutes. Okay, so I just want to briefly outline the key debates on precarity and agency before I'm going to be moving on to looking at some of the data. And just to sort of highlight that critical migration scholarship has shown that how a combination of a more restrictive immigration policy alongside more liberalised economic policies renders migrants of many categories much more vulnerable to various forms of exploitation, often characterised as modern slavery. So Kalleberg, Standing and Burrowoy have argued that precarious work and conditions associated with it is the product of neoliberal economies and globalisation. At the same time, immigration controls have themselves been challenged for having an increasingly exclusionary effect on migrants whose low-skilled labour is in fact in high demand by those nation states. And migration regimes themselves have been seen as complicit in the production of precarity. So development scholars such as Deshinka and her colleagues go on further to show how the process of precaritization forms a precondition for migrants in the global south entering into the economy and political systems of international labour circulation. The legislation aimed at protecting migrants, like anti-trafficking and the modern slavery agenda, conversely has unintended consequences. So, for example, much earlier, Jens Lurche in 2007, in responding to the International Labour Organisation's early global alliance against forced labour, warned of the dangers of cocooning or ghettoising forms of forced labour, especially the worst forms of indecent labour from the rest of the economy. So he argued that rather than tackling the underlying structures producing a wide range of exploitation, targeting the narrow category of experience was much safer and easier for national governments and international organisations to deal with. So he argued that this was a very convenient political strategy. So this was very similar to the way in which raid and rescue policies aimed at saving exploited groups such as trafficked, undocumented and sex workers have also often acted to further entrench their vulnerability rather than to protect them. They've been criticised for playing the role of immigration detection and deportation rather than protection. And a very similar parallel can be drawn with the modern slavery agenda today in the face of the threat of uncontrolled migration. So critics argue that this might be one of the sort of unintended or subtle intended focuses of modern slavery agenda. So illicit and covert labour exploitation outlined by Lurche and also Rogley as well. So a focus on undocumented labour migration under the modern slavery agenda may simply displace concerns of addressing wider structural issues for governments, rather than actually shifting attention towards rather than to shift attention to smaller and worst case scenarios, which are much easier and more containable to address and present solutions for. So examples like this reflect claims in the literature about the complexity of precarity and also the multiple and reinforcing ways in which precarity might be created by different actors and different systems. So in light of this, Paret and Gleeson have called for the use of the concept of migrant precarity, which they argue that precarity, unlike insecurity or vulnerability, emphasizes the way in which micro-processes experienced by migrants connect to macro processes which are related to the broader political economic structures, and call for connecting migrant experiences to the study of these broader micro shifts. Precarity may be experienced by, sorry, it's my son coming into the room. Precarity may be experienced in a number of reinforcing ways, such as vulnerability to deportation regimes, exclusion from public services and state protection, insecure employment, exploitation to work, and insecure livelihoods, and also the experience of everyday discrimination or isolation. So scholars have highlighted the inherent role of agency in all of these processes and have cautioned between the distinctions made between precarity or subjectivization and agency. So they argue that both of those things are existing simultaneously. And also the same for choice and coercion, which Julia Connell-Davidson argues are never sort of black and white and distinct positions. Instead, these are viewed as, both of these are viewed as part of the migration process. So Paret and Gleeson refer to the migration agency and precarity lens, in which different forms of and degrees of agency have been identified in the migration experience and in experiences of migrant precarity. So in a rejection of the classic migration theories, which are often based on rational choice decision-making, critical migration theories prioritize a more nuanced focus on constrained choice, which give rise to different forms of agency. So here Paret and Gleeson outline 4 forms of agency, and I've listed these here in the PowerPoint in front of you. So migrants' decision to move, individual agency of workers, collective organising, and organising in other areas of social life. However, these forms of agency don't take into account the more informalised or smaller forms of agency that perhaps don't directly impact on migrants' broader conditions and sort of liberation. And so the work of Deshingar is very useful here because she goes further to distinguish between forms of individual agency, which can present informal contestations, and formal legal forms of contestations. So in focusing on these informal contestations, Deshingar recognizes survival strategies as a form of constrained agency, even though these may not be emancipatory. And such survival strategies might be useful for understanding the experiences and responses of migrants who are more atomized or isolated in the economy, and who experience less traditional forms of migrant collectivization. And this very much illustrates the case of the Vietnamese migrants in the UK. Okay, so what I want to do now is to move on to look at some of the data to outline some of these debates that I've been talking you through. And I'm going to be structuring the exploration through these three different forms of precarity-agency that are emerging in our data with Vietnamese migrants and experts. And the first is the strategy of agency or the expression of agency through decisions to move, taking one of the first categories of agency from Paret and Gleeson. The second we'll look at is the way in which migrants experience precarity, very much because of the immigration system and modern slavery policies, and in relation to the global economy as well. And the third one, then I'll be looking at some smaller scale survival strategies outlined by Deshingar through strategies of waiting, networks, ethnic networks, and advice giving. Okay. So in an interview with one of our experts that we interviewed in the UK, who's an expert in trafficking, and she's done some very interesting research with different migrant national groups in the UK. She points out in her interview that the Vietnamese are a very distinctive group when it comes to their experiences of migration and when they end up becoming trafficked as well. So she says that it's kind of quite interesting the amount of preparation people were putting into it. You know, it wasn't like our picture of trafficking, of people being taken off the street or snatched and drugged and then woken up in Russia, although that did happen. It was very different. It was very planned, and it was almost like you know, very active, proactive, very rational decisions being made. So it was really interesting to hear her voicing this, especially as someone who has looked at more extreme experiences of Vietnamese migrants, because it very much chimed with some of the data that we found in our projects. And so I just want to highlight some of these. So the first participant we're looking at here was a prospective migrant who is a male in his late 20s in Haiphong. And he talks very much about this notion of striving. So I want to strive, and he's looking around and seeing rapid socioeconomic development, urbanization in his area. So while looking at my neighborhood that's full of high buildings, I want to strive and also have a dream of a big capital to develop my finances. He goes on to explain his situation. With our current salary on average, we earn 30 million per month. And so it would need about 10 years to reach anything comparable to that he's seeing with his neighbours who have family members who've migrated abroad. And so he explains, it's always burning in my head how to get out of this poverty. I've been researching this carefully. So, for example, I'll decide if I decide to go there, if I can earn at least 60 to 100 million dong each month. So that's roughly over 5,000 Canadian dollars, or over 3,000 UK dollars. Because my income, my wife and I already have enough for our living expenses. And I thought about the worst thing that can happen to me if I'm there, like if I have a fake marriage contract, then that's guaranteed and it's okay. But what if I'm unemployed? Because I still heard some information from people about the work over there, but nothing is certain. So I thought what was very interesting about this was this notion of striving. So that the need to strive because of the role of development and urbanization in Vietnam, but at the same time, this very, very clear idea of his goal. So he's researched the situation quite carefully. He knows a lot of people who've migrated to the UK and what their situation is when they return. He's mapped out the different routes into the UK, how much it might cost for a fake marriage versus going on a tourist visa and overstaying versus going on the back of a lorry, and some of the risks that might entail. And so he's got a very clear idea of what he's prepared to do and where his sort of boundaries and limits are. And I think this was very interesting when we interviewed a returnee in Haiphong, who was in the UK for six years. And he worked in a nail salon of a family member. He didn't earn as much as he wanted to, only about 20% of what he expected. And so he went to work in the cannabis industry, and then he got caught by the UK police and deported back to Vietnam, and he was given this £3,000 settlement fee. But what's interesting was that in his narrative, even though he had a kind of failed migration in terms of the money that he needed to pay back his moneylenders, he still wants to return. There's still a strong drive to return back to the UK. And this is actually based on economic reasons, but also for political reasons too, where he feels his human rights are more protected in the UK. Okay. So here is another example of migrant and prospective migrant who is intending to migrate to the UK, who explains, who demonstrates a real awareness of the hardships that he's likely to face in the UK. So he talks about, so he says, to be honest, those who go there must be very strong and have to find their way over there. They can't just sit there in one place and wait. So he's sort of responding to this claim about sort of passive migrants. They can't wait for the opportunity to come or sit in one place, that people will just give them money, because it's only if they actually earn money. And then he understands the intensity of the situation, but the intensity of the work there, they have to put a lot of effort into work. And when you put too much effort that exceeds their ability, they gradually become exhausted. And at that moment, people might choose to go back to Vietnam and to live. He says, I've got to consider those things, and I have to ask my family, who are currently some of them in the UK, to support me in getting a job. But the main thing is that I have to try my best to work, to take care of my family better in Vietnam. So it's very interesting the way he's got this very sort of a strong awareness of what the issues are and what it is he has to do in order to achieve success in his migration journey. And he also, like the previous participant, talks about the sort of boundaries of what he's willing to do in terms of the sort of conditions of exploitation he's willing to go through in order to earn his money. So he says, going there without any paper, no citizenship, I'm willing to sacrifice to live in the cannabis farm for about 1 to 2 years to earn that money and then go back. I don't have the intention to get into it too deep. There's no way out if I get into it too deep. So he's sort of weighing up the pros and cons and the risks of working in an illegal cannabis farm in the UK, and the various risks that might entail, but aware of the high gains that can earn him. Okay, so I'm yes. So okay, so I'm going to move on to my next section, and I'm just going to shrink my screen a little bit so I can see where I am, I want to look at some of the experiences of precarity through the immigration system and the modern slavery policy in the UK. And one of these relates to the debate around age contradictions and the presumption of age, which is specified in the Act around becoming of age at 18, and how the authorities should be sort of labelling and judging different groups according to presumed age, considering that most of these migrants don't have any documents. Thank you, Anne, for your notification. Documents to prove their age. So I think what has been sort of really fascinating switches in the policy has been around age presumption, and certainly in the early 2000s there were many reports of young Vietnamese migrants in their 20s who were coming to the UK to claim asylum or to work as an undocumented migrant, and many of them in their mid-20s were presumed to be under 18 due to the sort of Orientalist racist stereotypes around sort of the passive and infantile Asian who lacked agency and could be seen as a worthy subject for Western protection and paternalism. And this really contradicts what we see now with some of the older Vietnamese migrants coming through, who are around the age of in their 30s and 40s, who are being perceived through a very different lens through the modern slavery focus on criminal networks, and have become themselves criminalized, even if they themselves are a victim of exploitation. So this is what we see here. This is another quote from Alice, the expert interviewee. So she says that in her research, they were 30 or 40-year-old men, very atypical in terms of thinking about trafficking. That's generally not thought about. And one key thing was that they hadn't been identified in the UK as being exploited in any way. What was happening was the police were just raiding these cannabis factories, these horrible dawn raids, and they were arresting people in there, including either the young or the middle-aged Vietnamese men, taking them to detention centres, going through the court systems and being found guilty of an offence, and then being essentially returned to Vietnam without any consideration at all of whether they've been demonstrated indicators of trafficking or exploitation. So she said it just wasn't in the equation. They just weren't that sort of stereotypical victim, and they haven't been identified. And so that was sort of a really, really stunning thing for her. By comparison, this was very distinct from the research that Hai and I did back in 2016, where we saw lots of young people in their 20s who were presumed to be under 18 and were put into foster care and had their agency taken away from them because they were seen to be younger than they actually were. And then this age, this contention of whether you have crossed the threshold of being 18 or whether you are under 18 came with all sorts of potential benefits around protection from the state. And then when you become 18, all of those benefits get taken away from you. And here's an illustration from the online data around a young woman who is now in a very, very precarious situation because she's got over the age of 18 and she now no longer has the protection that she had when she was younger. So she says, I applied for asylum 3 years ago when I was 16, and I was put into social housing accommodation and sent to school. Now I'm 19 and have a 5-month-old baby, and her father doesn't have any IDs. The Home Office rejected my application for asylum and sent me a set of forms that then said I could appeal. I've consulted the solicitor who said my documents were too weak and the evidence I provided wasn't strong enough, and I might have to pursue this in a court, but the chances of winning are not very high and I don't know what to do. So she's asking, along with many users of these websites, for advice. I'm desperate for your advice. I'm very anxious. I don't have much time left to make an appeal. I've sent the appeal forms to the Home Office within the next 5 days. I have to send them in the next 5 days. My baby's too young and she doesn't want it to be sent back to Vietnam. And this will often be for a number of different reasons, you know, the social shame of returning back home as a single mother, and a range of other areas that we can maybe explore a bit later. So she says, presently I'm still living in this social housing accommodation supported by the social workers. Hope you guys can help me. Thank you very much. So we can see the sort of flip side of the ways in which distinctions around age can render different categories of Vietnamese migrants quite vulnerable. Okay, so now I want to look at the way in which issues of precarity through the immigration in relation to work. And here his just sort of one of the quotes from one of our community informants, Vietnamese community informants, who talks about the number of migrants that they engage with, and these are their main challenges: to get paper, to get asylum status, and also because they don't have any papers, they can't work in a legal way. And so he describes their very precarious condition because of this. They have to be alert all the time. They can be arrested at any time. The owner of the nail shop, for example, can be fined heavily. So they're always dancing because they have to. They don't have any support from the government in terms of finance. So how to survive? They've got to work hard. And when you work hard, because they have no permission or no license, that means they can be arrested. So they live under this daily pressure. So this issue then of having to engage in almost a form of self-exploitation to survive in the UK because of this is what lack of provision for undocumented migrants and lack of willingness to provide undocumented migrants with some sort of status precaritizes their situation in this way. This is further reflected upon by another migrant who's 40 years old and still in the UK, in his decision to stay on and work in a cannabis farm. And he explains the constraints that leads him to this. So he says that who didn't want a stable straight job with a reasonable income, but we should have valid papers and certificates for working in nail bars or restaurant kitchens. Otherwise we had to work illegally, and of course with low wages, but it's not easy being admitted to work illegally either. Employers were afraid of being fined, and the law had it that employers would be financially punished or even forced to close their businesses once approved of hiring undocumented workers. Hence, employers must protect themselves before deciding to help us. Then we had no other choice to take risks. We couldn't wait for death to come, right? And so this is really important because, you know, in the modern slavery debates, there's a lot of discussion around exploitative employers in the Vietnamese nail salons and restaurants and cannabis industry. However, you know, in our data and also in other research, we find very, very little evidence of employers actually exploiting the migrants. Instead, the migrants tend to talk about their employers as helping them out. You know, as illustrated in the first quote, you know, migrants have to sort of, you know, engage in this sort of grueling work regime in order to survive in the UK and hopefully send some money home to pay back the smuggling debts that they took out to pay for their journey to come to the UK. And this issue of waiting for death was a very common one for migrants, both in Vietnam and in the UK, whether that be social death, the sort of social shame of being poor in Vietnam, or sort of ultimate death through these various systems in the UK. So just a last illustration. Yes, I must speed up. Last illustration really through about the precarity through the immigration through raid and rescue. Raid and rescue is a policy where sort of police officers go into a nail salon or a cannabis farm and try and you know, pick up undocumented migrants and any sort of gang leaders who might be exploiting them and refer them back to the national referral mechanism. But this is some of the, I just want to illustrate briefly the consequences of the raid and rescue policy. So Alice talks us through what she found in her research in relation to victims sent back to Vietnam, was that suddenly they were found guilty of an offence in the UK and they were back in Vietnam with no money because they didn't get salaries and they didn't get the money that was owed to them. So they had this sort of failed migration label coming with them, and a lot of people were suffering. And so one of her participants said, my neighbours despised me because I came back with nothing. You know, I came back failed. I didn't do what I was meant to do for my family. And this person's wife divorced them and his neighbours wouldn't speak to them. And so here, this issue about, you know, raid and rescue is supposed to be in line with modern slavery policy, which protects victims. But what's being observed here is that this criminalisation, this prosecution is very heavy, and actually there's a form of state abuse rather than and a harming of vulnerable victims rather than enabling them and protecting them. So we have some survival strategies, and I'm not sure if I can take another sort of minute to wrap up. I've gone over my time.
Yeah,
time already.
No worries.
Thanks. there have been a range of survival strategies that might be understood as agency that we've observed in our data. And the strategy of waiting could be understood as one of them. So this idea of waiting is one of the things that migrants can do. They've paid a very high price for their journey, but also in terms of the risks they've had to take. And so they want to remain in the UK, even though their existence may be relatively miserable. So it's better to wait. It's wait to see the light at the end of the tunnel rather than go back into the tunnel, our informant tells us. And in our social media data, here is sort of a post that was very striking, where a quite old migrant talks about having been here in the UK for 10 years now. It's sort of in limbo, waiting. My application has been rejected again, which we refer from the rest of the story. In the UK, I've got no home, no family, no identification, and my health is getting worse. I'm very weak, and I'm afraid that I'll faint whilst working. So he's struggling to continue to work to support himself. I'm very unhappy, and I just want to go home. He's trying to find a way to get a free flight home because he just can't manage. This waiting is just, literally almost, killing him, really damaging his health. So other survival strategies in terms of agency relate to migrant solidarity networks. Some of these relate to religion and the really important role that religion plays for some of the migrants in the UK, particularly many of them come through a Catholic network, so that is very important for them. The other one relates to the use of kin networks, co-ethnic networks, and the role of family in the UK, which means that migrants don't access the whole range of services, NGO and charity services that might be available to them. And the chat room and social media sites are also a very important source of advice and support for these migrants. And they share experience on how to negotiate and survive the immigration system. And what was striking in our research there was that between 2009 and 2015, over 1,500 inquiries were made about visa, asylum and settlement documents, how to negotiate, survive the immigration system, and only 231 were about studying or work in the UK. So people weren't concerned around work conditions and exploitation. They were concerned about how to navigate this really punitive immigration system. Okay, so I'm just to sort of go over these last points, just to illustrate some of the key findings of our research, is that I think that the agency through decisions to move, certainly complicates the issue of consent set out in the Modern Slavery Act, and links into the precarity in the global economy, the need to leave Vietnam because of wanting to escape certain social death. The UK immigration and modern slavery policies are creating precarity. So our data really reinforces what's been already argued in the literature in terms of vulnerability to deportation, exclusion from state protection, or inability to access various forms of protection because of fear of the immigration system, and being pushed into more precarious and insecure employment conditions. I've just illustrated that we've seen a range of survival strategies. I'm not quite sure if we can think of these as agency in terms of waiting, religion, kin networks. These are essential, but they also prevent migrants from seeking other sources of support and also render them sometimes more vulnerable to this form of precarity that I've been explaining. So I'm really sorry for running over so much, but I'd like to stop my presentation there, and I'd love to hear any questions and comments that you might have.
Thank you very much,
I'll unshare my